right, everyone, buckle up. Because today, we're taking a deep dive into the world of Jinn.
Oh, yeah. I'm excited about this one.
Yeah, this is going to be good. We're going way beyond the whole, genie in a lamp thing,
Right.
Like, everyone's got that image in their head.
Yeah, the wish-granting genie. Totally.
Exactly. We're talking about the real deal here, the Jinn, and their significance in Islamic culture. So get ready for some serious myth-busting.
I'm happy to help with that.
Mhm.
You're right about that genie image, though. It's a misconception that's been around for centuries, thanks to those 18th century translations of 1001 Nights. They kind of painted jinn as these always helpful spirits, almost like guardian angels.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah, and that's not really the full picture, is it?
Not even close from what I've heard.
Right. And get this, the word jinn itself. It might actually be connected to the old Roman word, genius.
Whoa, really?
Yeah. Like the guardian spirits the Romans used to talk about.
Yeah.
The ones tied to specific people or places.
Fascinating, right? That is fascinating. Makes you think about how these ideas travel across cultures and time. But it does make me wonder, are jinn always these benevolent beings watching over us? Because I gotta be honest, that doesn't quite match up with everything else I've heard about them.
You're right to be skeptical. They're definitely not your typical guardian angel. And this is key. Jinn aren't inherently good or evil. They're more complex than that.
Okay, so how should I think about them?
Imagine them on a spectrum, kind of like us humans, capable of both good and bad. A bit of a difference from the Western idea of demons and angels, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, that's definitely different. I've always pictured jinn as those mischievous troublemakers. Maybe even a little menacing, lurking in the shadows. Probably because of how pop culture portrays them, to be honest.
That'll do it every time. Pop culture loves a good jinn story. But to really understand them, we need to go way back, before Islam even existed. We're talking ancient Arabian beliefs, maybe even links to even earlier Persian mythology.
Now you're speaking my language. Ancient history and whispers of mythology. This is where things get really interesting.
Oh, it's a fascinating history for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the thing. While the Quran acknowledges jinn, it doesn't necessarily endorse all those old beliefs surrounding them.
Right.
The Quran being the holy book of Islam, of course. It states that jinn were created by God from smokeless fire. And this is crucial, just like humans. They have free will, and they're accountable for their actions in the afterlife.
Hold up, smokeless fire. Now that's an origin story. So we've got these beings made of smokeless fire running around with free will. But what about that whole thing about jinn hanging out in deserts and causing trouble? That seems to be a recurring theme, right?
Yeah, that's a common one.
Yeah.
And that idea takes root in pre-Islamic Arabia, where people often linked jinn to those desolate, untamed places.
Oh, I see.
Blamed them for all sorts of things. Sudden illnesses, strange events, you name it.
Wow. So they were kind of like scapegoats for anything they couldn't explain.
Exactly. And you know what? Even today, those beliefs are still around. In many cultures, people still attribute mental illness to jinn possession.
Wow, that's both fascinating and a little creepy to think about. It's amazing how these ancient beliefs have that kind of staying power. But, okay, what about those stories about sorcerers battling and controlling jinn? Are those fantastical tales rooted in any truth?
Well, it's not as far-fetched as it might seem.
Yeah.
The idea of sorcery and being able to command jinn, that's a deep-seated belief. We even see it in old texts like Kitab al-Farist by Ibn al-Nadim. He was a scholar back in the 10th century.
Okay.
And his work really digs into sorcery and how people tried to control jinn. Even some super well-respected Islamic scholars like al-Abalasi, they wrote about this stuff too.
So we're not just talking campfire stories here. We're talking about serious scholars who dedicated their lives to understanding these matters.
Exactly. And their perspective adds another layer to it, don't you think?
For sure. So what did they say? How did they think about it?
Well, they were a bit more nuanced. They emphasized that true power, even over jinn, ultimately belongs to God. It wasn't about brute force, but appealing to a higher authority.
Fascinating. So even these jinn born of smokeless fire, they weren't all powerful. Were there ways for people to protect themselves from the not-so-nice ones? To kind of fight back?
You got it.
Yeah.
Think about it. If people believed these beings could harm them, they would come up with ways to ward them off, right?
Right.
Amulets inscribed with God's name are everywhere.
Mm.
People believed they offered serious protection. And get this, there's this belief that jinns are terrified of iron and wolves.
Whoa, seriously. Iron and wolves, that's wild.
Right. It's this really interesting clash between the unseen world and these everyday things.
It's like a tangible link between the spiritual and the material world. I love it. It's incredible how these beliefs intertwine. It's almost as if jinn reflect our own nature, capable of good and evil, bound by faith and fear. just like us.
You've hit the nail on the head. That's the view the Quran emphasizes. It puts jinn and humans on a similar spiritual playing field, both accountable to a higher power. It's this really nuanced perspective that allows for a much deeper understanding of jinn, not just as these mythical creatures, but as beings that are woven into this whole monotheistic belief system.
This is really making me see Jinn in a whole new light. It's a lot to process. We've covered so much ground, their origins, their nature, even their potential societies. But we've only just scratched the surface, haven't we?
Oh, there's so much more to explore.
Yeah. We need to take a quick break, but don't go anywhere. When we come back, we'll dive even deeper into the world of Jinn. We'll be exploring what they might look like, those fascinating Jinn societies you mentioned, and the very unsettling phenomenon of Jinn possession. Stay tuned. Okay, so we're back, and we've been talking about how Jinn can be both kind of scary, but also strangely relatable. But it's got me thinking, what do these beings actually look like? I mean, are we talking shadowy figures, glowing apparitions? Give me the visual details.
See, that's where things get really interesting. The word jinn itself, it kind of hints at something hidden and elusive. You even mentioned it earlier, that whole idea of them being concealed from the senses.
Right, like they exist just outside our normal perception.
Exactly, that whole invisibility thing. It's a big part of understanding jinn. They might have physical bodies, at least that's what we often hear, but those bodies are supposed to be made of this like thin and subtle material. Lets them change their forms whenever they want.
Okay, so shapeshifters. That explains all those stories about Jinn appearing in different forms.
Exactly. Some Islamic scholars and theologians have gone back and forth about how much they can actually shapeshift,
Yeah.
but popular belief, it gives them a pretty wide range. They could be animals, snakes and scorpions seem to be popular choices, or even take on human forms to blend right in.
Okay, now that's a little creepy. Are you telling me I could bump into a Jinn on the street and not even know it?
It's possible, I guess. But remember, this jinn don't always interact with us. In fact, a lot of sources say they'd rather keep to themselves. They've got their own communities and societies structured in ways that might mirror our own civilizations.
Wait, hold on, Jinn societies. Now that's a mental image. What are we talking about here? Elaborate underground cities. Secret societies with their own rules and traditions. This is blowing my mind.
I know, right? It's one of the most intriguing aspects of jinn lore, for sure. But here's the catch. The sources we have, they tend to be pretty vague on the specifics. It's almost like knowing too much about the jinn world is dangerous, like we're not supposed to know. But we get these little hints, suggesting that their societies might have hierarchies, rules, maybe even conflicts just like ours.
Okay, you've definitely piqued my curiosity. But I have a feeling we could spend hours talking about Jinn social structures alone, and we've got other areas to explore. Like we touched on Jinn possession earlier, and to be honest, it's one of those things that I find both fascinating and a little unsettling. Is there any way to tell if someone is actually possessed? Like, what does that even mean?
It's important to say up front that I'm not a doctor, so I can't really speak to any kind of medical diagnosis.
Yeah.
But looking back across so many cultures, whenever something unexplained happened, especially illnesses, people often blamed it on jinn possession.
What kind of illnesses are we talking about? Give me some examples.
Think of anything that didn't have an obvious explanation. Sudden seizures, paralysis, bizarre behavior, personality changes, out of nowhere, the whole 9 yards. Especially in the past, those are the kinds of things people would attribute to some kind of malevolent jinn.
And that's where those amulets we talked about come in, right? For protection from all that unseen stuff.
Exactly. Amulets with verses from the Quran or even just God's name on them, they were and still are in some cultures considered really powerful protection against jinn and other harmful entities. It's like a way to feel safe, something tangible to ward off the invisible.
It's fascinating how these beliefs give people comfort, a way to cope with things they don't understand, even if it's just a feeling of control, right?
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
But it's more than just that. This power that people give to amulets, the fear of jinn hiding in the shadows, it shows just how much humans need to make sense of the world. Especially the things we can't explain. And jinn, with all their shape-shifting and connections to this unseen world, they give us a framework to try and understand the things that scare us, the things we can't control.
That makes a lot of sense. When we can't explain something, it's almost easier to blame it on a mischievous jinn than to accept that sometimes things just happen.
You said it. But it's important to remember something we discussed before. Jinn aren't all out to get us. Just like people, they can be good or bad. Some are even believed to be quite religious, following the rules of Islam as closely as any human.
Really? So there are good jinn?
Oh, yeah. There are Islamic scholars who say that God created jinn specifically to test humanity, to see who would choose to be good, even when faced with temptation. It's a fascinating thought, isn't it?
It's amazing how much there is to learn about Jinn. We've talked about where they come from, what they're like, even their potential societies. But there's one thing I'm super curious about. It's how Jinn show up in art and literature, especially those stories about sorcerers who can control them. It's like straight out of a fantasy novel.
Yeah, those stories are definitely captivating, and they've been around for centuries.
Right, there's something so compelling about them.
It's more than just entertainment, though. These stories, they reflect the anxieties and moral struggles of the time they were written in. You know, even the philosophical debates people were having.
So you're saying they're not just fantastical tales, they're a way to explore deeper truths through metaphor and allegory.
Exactly. Like, think about the legend of King Solomon. He's a really important figure in both Islamic and Jewish traditions. And he's often shown as having power over jinn, commanding them to build temples and do all sorts of incredible things.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that. Didn't he have a special ring or a seal that gave him control over them?
You got it. The legend of Solomon's ring is
Mhm.
like this powerful metaphor for how much humans want to control the unknown, to harness these powerful forces for their own benefit. But it also makes you think about that line between ambition and just being plain arrogant.
Because when you have that much power, it's easy to get carried away, right? Or at least be tempted to abuse it.
Exactly. Those stories, they often serve as warnings. They remind us that even the most powerful beings, they still have to answer to someone or something bigger than themselves.
That's a pretty universal theme, I think. It pops up in stories from all over the world. But let's talk about art specifically. You mentioned before that jinn aren't really depicted in Islamic art,
Mm.
which is interesting considering how important they are in Islamic tradition. Why is that?
That's a great question, and it's something scholars have been discussing for ages. Part of it might be because Islam, like a lot of monotheistic religions, traditionally avoids creating images of God or divine beings.
Right, to prevent idolatry. Representing the divine in art can be a really sensitive subject.
Absolutely. And it goes even deeper than that. The very nature of Jinn, their invisibility, their shape-shifting abilities, it makes them incredibly hard to capture visually. How do you depict something that's constantly changing, something that exists right at the edge of perception?
It's like trying to paint a dream. Trying to give form to something that's inherently formless is a really interesting challenge. I hadn't thought about that before.
Exactly.
Hmm.
But that doesn't mean jinn are totally absent from Islamic art. They show up in symbolic ways, like swirling patterns or hybrid creatures, things that hint at their otherworldly nature. And of course, there are all those stories and poems that have been passed down for generations. They keep the legend of the jinn alive in a way that art just can't.
It's incredible how these ancient beliefs are still around, still captivating people in a world that's so focused on science and technology.
It really is. And you know what I think? It says something about what it means to be human.
Hmm.
That curiosity we all have about the unknown, the desire to find meaning in a world that can feel so chaotic and unpredictable. Jinn, with their magic, their mystery, and their moral complexity,
Yeah.
they give us a way to explore those timeless questions. They challenge us to look at our own beliefs and wrestle with the shadows within ourselves, just as much as the ones we see in the world around us.
That's a powerful thought to end on, I think. It's been an amazing journey exploring the world of Jinn, and you've given me so much to think about. So, to everyone listening out there, next time you come across the word Jinn, whether you're reading a story, having a conversation, or just thinking to yourself, remember there's always more to discover, more to learn. The world, both seen and unseen, is full of wonders and mysteries. Never stop exploring, never stop questioning, and you might just find your own interpretations of these incredible, enduring legends.